For more than a century, Egypt was not Egypt. The throne of the pharaohs, the seat that had been occupied by an unbroken line of Egyptian kings stretching back more than 1,000 years, was held by foreigners. They came from the east. They crossed the Sinai. They settled in the Delta, the rich, fertile, incomparably productive agricultural heartland of Lower Egypt, and they built their capital at a place called Avaris, a city that Egyptian texts barely mention and that later generations would try to erase from history altogether. They were called the Hyksos, a name that comes from the Egyptian phrase Heqau-khasut, meaning rulers of foreign lands. And they did something that no foreign power had ever done before in the history of the Nile Valley. They conquered Egypt, not a province, not a border region, not a trading post. They took the Delta, they took Memphis. They took the ancient religious centers and the administrative nerve centers and the agricultural surplus that had sustained Egyptian civilization for 15 centuries. And for roughly 108 years, according to the chronology preserved in later king lists, they sat on the throne of the pharaohs and ruled the richest kingdom in the ancient world. The Egyptian response to this humiliation was not immediate. It was not dramatic. It was not a single heroic act of liberation carried out by a single legendary warrior king. It was slow. It was multi-generational. It was a campaign of resistance that began in the far south of Egypt, in Thebes, the city that had saved Egypt once before during the First Intermediate Period, and that built, over the course of 3 generations of Theban kings, from border skirmishes to regional warfare to a full-scale war of liberation that would drive the Hyksos from the Delta, reunify the 2 lands, and launch the most extraordinary era in the entire 3,000-year history of ancient Egypt, the New Kingdom. The man who finished the job, the pharaoh who led the final campaigns, broke the walls of Avaris, chased the Hyksos across the Sinai, and stood in the ruins of their capital as the first undisputed ruler of a unified Egypt in more than a century, was a young king named Ahmose I. He came to the throne as a child, probably no more than 10 years old, after the death of his father Senusret II and his brother Ahmose in the wars against the Hyksos. He inherited a kingdom that was not yet a kingdom, a Theban rump state that controlled Upper Egypt, but that was squeezed between the Hyksos in the north and the Nubian kingdom of Kerma in the south. He inherited a war that had already claimed the lives of at least 2 of his closest relatives, and he inherited a mission that had been passed from father to son like a sacred obligation to drive out the foreigners, restore the unity of the 2 lands, and reclaim the throne that rightfully belonged to the sons of Ra. The story of how that boy became one of the most important rulers in the history of human civilization. How he grew from a frightened child in a besieged city into the pharaoh who shattered the most powerful military force in the Nile Valley and reunified a kingdom that had been broken for more than a century, is a story that belongs not just to Egyptian history, but to the history of every civilization that has ever been conquered and has fought its way back to freedom. It is a story about what happens when the unthinkable occurs, when the walls that were supposed to be permanent are breached, when the throne that was supposed to be eternal is taken, when the civilization that believed itself to be the center of the world is forced to confront the possibility that it is merely another kingdom in a world full of kingdoms, each armed and ambitious and willing to take what it could. And it is a story about what a people can become when they refuse to accept that the unthinkable is the final word. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand how a boy king from a besieged city in the south of Egypt accomplished what 3 generations of his ancestors had struggled and died to achieve. You are going to understand the military campaigns that shattered the Hyksos kingdom and reunified Egypt for the 3rd time in its history. You are going to understand the administrative and cultural revolution that followed the liberation. A revolution that transformed Egypt from a divided, diminished, and humiliated kingdom into the greatest imperial power the ancient world had ever seen. You are going to understand the extraordinary Queen Mother Ahotep, who held the kingdom together while her son was still a child, and the soldier Ahmose, son of Ibana, whose autobiography gives us the only first-hand account of the Liberation War. and you are going to understand the price of that transformation, the lives it consumed, the traditions it broke, the world it created, and the world it destroyed. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. To understand the world that Ahmose entered, and the war he was born to fight, we need to go back to the collapse that made the Hyksos invasion possible. The 12th Dynasty, the golden age of the Middle Kingdom, had ended around 1786 BC with the death of the female pharaoh Sebekneferu, who left no heir. The dynasty that Amenemhat I had founded through usurpation and sustained through institutional genius. The co-regency, the centralized administration, the literary propaganda, the fortress chain in Nubia had run its course. 2 centuries of stable governance, cultural brilliance, and administrative sophistication came to an end not with a dramatic collapse but with a quiet fading. The last flicker of a candle that had been burning for too long. What followed was the Second Intermediate Period, a term that Egyptologists use to describe the approximately 200 years of political fragmentation, foreign domination, and civil conflict that separated the Middle Kingdom from the New Kingdom. The 13th dynasty, which succeeded the 12th, was a shadow of its predecessor, producing more than 50 kings in roughly 150 years, most of them ruling for only a few years or even a few months before being replaced. The contrast with the 12th dynasty could not have been more stark. Where the 12th dynasty had produced 8 rulers in 2 centuries, each passing the throne smoothly to the next through the co-regency system that Amenemhat I had devised, the 13th dynasty produced a bewildering succession of short-lived kings whose names, in many cases, survive only in fragmentary inscriptions on scarabs and minor monuments. The administrative system that Senusret III had built continued to function, but without the driving force of a strong pharaoh at the center, it gradually lost its effectiveness. The centralized state that had been the Middle Kingdom's greatest achievement began to fragment. Slowly at first, then with accelerating speed, as provincial officials accumulated local power and the central government's ability to enforce its authority diminished. The speed of the decline was striking. Within 50 years of Sebekneferu's death, the Egyptian state had fragmented to a degree not seen since the darkest days of the First Intermediate Period. The 14th dynasty, a series of minor kings who may have ruled simultaneously with the late 13th dynasty from a base in the Western Delta, added to the chaos. The bureaucratic apparatus that Senusret III had built, the administrative system that had been the pride and the power of the Middle Kingdom, was crumbling. The frontier fortresses in Nubia, the great chain of installations that Senusret had built to control the Second Cataract, were gradually abandoned, their garrisons withdrawn as the central government could no longer sustain the logistical effort required to maintain them. The Kingdom of Kerma, Egypt's ancient rival to the south, advanced northward to fill the vacuum, expanding its territory and its influence at Egypt's expense. The carefully maintained border defences, the walls of the ruler that Amenemhat I had built along the eastern frontier, became porous, then ineffective, then irrelevant. The empire that the 12th dynasty had so painstakingly assembled was dissolving, piece by piece, like a sandcastle in the tide. It was into this vacuum of weakening central authority that the Hyksos moved. The exact nature of the Hyksos takeover of Lower Egypt is one of the most debated questions in Egyptology. The traditional narrative, preserved in the writings of the Egyptian priest Manetho, who compiled a history of Egypt in the 3rd century BC, describes a sudden, violent invasion, a horde of foreign warriors sweeping across the Sinai, burning cities, destroying temples, and subjugating the Egyptian population through brute force. Manetho's account, written more than 1,000 years after the events it describes, was deeply influenced by the Egyptian cultural memory of the Hyksos as barbarian invaders who had violated the sacred land. His language is vivid and hostile. He describes the Hyksos burning cities ruthlessly, treating the native population with great cruelty, and committing acts of sacrilege that offended the gods themselves. But the archaeological evidence tells a different story. A story that is more complicated, more ambiguous, and in some ways more unsettling than the simple narrative of invasion and conquest. Excavations at Tel el-Dabba, the site of ancient Avaris, the Hyksos capital, located in the eastern delta, have been conducted by the Austrian archaeologist Manfred Biertak and his team since the 1960s, and they have revealed a picture of the Hyksos presence that is far more nuanced than Manetho's account suggests. The archaeological evidence shows that a population of Levantine origin, people from the region of modern-day Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, had been settling in the eastern delta for centuries before the Hyksos period. These settlers were not invaders in any conventional sense. They were immigrants, traders, craftsmen, farmers, and labourers who had been drawn to the delta by its agricultural wealth and its proximity to the Levantine trade routes. They brought with them their own customs, their own pottery styles, their own burial practices, and their own religious traditions, including the worship of the storm god Baal, whom they identified with the Egyptian god Seth. The distinction matters because it changes the moral and political meaning of the Hyksos period. If the Hyksos were foreign invaders who conquered Egypt by force, as the traditional narrative suggests, then the Theban War of Liberation was a straightforward act of national defense, a struggle to expel an aggressor who had seized power illegitimately. But if the Hyksos were a settled community that gradually accumulated political power within a weakening Egyptian state, which the archaeological evidence increasingly supports, then the situation was more complicated. The Hyksos were not outsiders who broke down the gates. They were insiders who took over the house, a community that had been living in Egypt for generations, that had intermarried with the local population, that had adopted many Egyptian customs and traditions, and that had risen to power not through a dramatic act of conquest, but through the patient exploitation of political weakness. The Egyptian characterization of the Hyksos as barbarian invaders was, in this light, a retrospective invention, a narrative constructed after the fact to justify the wars of liberation and to demonize an enemy that was, in reality, far more Egyptian than the propaganda admitted. The Hyksos takeover of Lower Egypt may have been less a sudden invasion than a gradual process of demographic infiltration followed by political consolidation, a process in which a growing foreign population, established in the delta over generations, eventually accumulated enough power to assert political control over the weakened Egyptian state. Biertak's excavations at Tel el-Dabba show a continuous occupation of the site from the late Middle Kingdom through the Hyksos period, with a gradual increase in Levantine cultural elements, pottery, architecture, burial customs, that suggests a slow process of cultural transformation rather than a sudden rupture. The Hyksos, in this view, were not foreign conquerors who burst upon an unsuspecting Egypt. They were an established community that seized a political opportunity created by the collapse of central authority. There is one more comparison worth considering, one that brings a different and more sobering perspective to the discussion. The Balkan peoples who were conquered by the Ottoman Empire in the 14th and 15th centuries experienced a form of foreign domination that lasted even longer than the Hyksos rule of Egypt, in some cases, nearly 5 centuries. The Greek, Serbian, Bulgarian, and Romanian peoples lived for generations under Ottoman rule, preserving their languages, their religions, and their cultural identities against the pressure of assimilation. When they finally won their independence in the 19th century, in a series of national liberation movements that bore a structural resemblance to the Theban War against the Hyksos, they emerged as nations that were profoundly shaped by the experience of Ottoman domination. Their military cultures, their administrative systems, their national mythologies, and their sense of national identity were all products of the centuries-long struggle against foreign rule. The memory of Ottoman domination became, for these nations, the foundational experience of their national identity, the event that defined who they were, what they had endured, and why they had the right to exist as independent nations. The Greek War of Independence of 1821, celebrated as the founding event of the modern Greek state, was fought by men who invoked the memory of ancient Greek glory and the suffering of Ottoman rule with equal fervour. The Serbian uprising of 1804, led by Karađorđe, a pig farmer who became a military commander, was fueled by the memory of Kosovo and by 5 centuries of accumulated resentment against Ottoman rule. In each case, the experience of foreign domination had created a national identity that was defined, at its core, by the determination to prevent the experience from ever being repeated, the trauma around which their sense of themselves as peoples was organized. The parallels with Egypt's experience of the Hyksos are striking. The Serbs remember the Battle of Kosovo of 1389, a defeat at the hands of the Ottoman Turks that marks the beginning of Serbian subjugation, with a reverence and an intensity that is remarkably similar to the way the New Kingdom Egyptians remembered the Hyksos invasion. Kosovo is the Serbian wound, the event around which Serbian national identity is organized, the memory that fuels Serbian nationalism to this day. The Hyksos invasion played a similar role in Egyptian cultural memory, a wound that was healed by the New Kingdom, but that was never fully forgotten, a memory that shaped the way the Egyptians understood themselves and their relationship to the outside world for centuries after the last Hyksos king had been driven from the land. The New Kingdom pharaohs invoked the Hyksos as a cautionary example, a reminder of what happens when Egypt is weak, when its borders are undefended, when its military is unprepared. The anti-Hyksos rhetoric that appears in New Kingdom texts is not merely historical propaganda. It is a statement of policy, a declaration that the primary responsibility of the pharaoh is to protect the sacred land from the foreigners who would defile it, and that the price of failing in this responsibility is the repetition of the Hyksos nightmare and their relationship to the outside world for centuries, after the last Hyksos king had been driven from the land. In both cases, the memory of foreign domination became the most powerful source of national identity and the most enduring motivation for military strength and political cohesion. But here is the problem. Whatever the mechanism of their rise to power, the Hyksos were foreigners ruling Egypt, and in the Egyptian worldview, this was an abomination. The pharaoh was not merely a political leader, he was the living embodiment of Horus, the maintainer of Mat, the indispensable link between the human and divine worlds. A foreign king on the throne of the pharaohs was not just a political humiliation. It was not merely an affront to national pride or a challenge to the established order. It was, in the Egyptian understanding of the universe, a cosmic catastrophe. It was a cosmic catastrophe, a rupture in the divine order that threatened the very fabric of reality. The Hyksos 15th Dynasty, the main Hyksos royal line, which ruled from Avaris for approximately a century, produced kings whose names are partially preserved in the Turin king list and in scattered inscriptions: Salitis, Kian, Apepi, and others whose names survive in corrupted forms that make identification uncertain. The most powerful of these kings, Apepi, also known as Apophis, ruled for approximately 40 years and was the Hyksos king against whom the Theban War of Liberation was directed. His reign was long enough and stable enough to suggest that the Hyksos kingdom was not a fragile foreign occupation, but a functioning state with institutional depth and popular support, at least within the Delta population, which included the Levantine immigrant community that formed the Hyksos power base. The Hyksos kings adopted Egyptian royal titles and customs. They used hieroglyphic script. They worshipped Egyptian gods alongside their own. They presented themselves as legitimate pharaohs in the Egyptian tradition. But this appropriation of Egyptian forms only deepened the insults. The foreigners were not merely ruling Egypt. They were claiming to be Egypt, claiming the divine authority that the Egyptian theological system reserved for the sons of Ra. The Hyksos capital of Avaris was itself a provocation. Located in the eastern delta, near the modern village of Tel El Daba, it was a city that reflected the hybrid character of the Hyksos regime, Egyptian in some respects, Levantine in others, and unique in its combination of cultural elements from both traditions. Beotak's excavations have revealed a city of considerable size and sophistication, with massive fortifications, palatial compounds decorated with Minoan-style frescoes that suggest diplomatic connections with the Aegean world, extensive workshops for the production of bronze weapons and luxury goods, and a harbour that connected the city to the Mediterranean trade networks. The Hyksos were not barbarians. They were sophisticated rulers who controlled a wealthy and strategically important kingdom, a kingdom that sat astride the trade routes connecting Africa to Asia and that generated revenues from commerce, agriculture, and the exploitation of Egypt's vast natural resources. The Hyksos period was not, as later Egyptian propaganda would suggest, a dark age of cultural barbarism. The archaeological evidence from Avaris reveals a vibrant, cosmopolitan civilization that in some respects was more connected to the wider world than the insular Middle Kingdom had been. Trade goods from across the eastern Mediterranean have been found at Tel el-Dabba, pottery from Cyprus, metalwork from the Levant, and most spectacularly, fragments of Minoan-style wall paintings depicting bull-leaping scenes and acrobatic displays that are virtually identical in style and technique to the frescoes of Knossos on Crete. These frescoes, discovered by BTAC's team in the 1990s, sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. Their presence at Avaris suggests a level of cultural exchange between the Hyksos court and the Minoan civilization of the Aegean that no one had previously suspected. Diplomatic connections, perhaps even dynastic marriages, that linked the Hyksos capital to one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the Bronze Age Mediterranean. The Hyksos were not isolated barbarian rulers clinging to power in a conquered land. They were participants in a vast network of commercial and diplomatic relationships that connected Egypt to the wider world in ways that the Middle Kingdom, for all its cultural brilliance, had never achieved. The Hyksos also introduced military technologies that would transform warfare in the ancient Near East. The horse-drawn war chariot, a weapon that had been developed on the steppe lands of Central Asia and had spread across the Near East during the early 2nd millennium BC, was brought to Egypt by the Hyksos and became, under the New Kingdom pharaohs, the decisive weapon of Egyptian military power. The composite bow, a more powerful and more accurate weapon than the simple self-bow that the Egyptians had used for millennia, was another Hyksos introduction. Bronze weapons of superior quality, new types of body armor, and new military tactics all entered Egypt through the Hyksos connection with the wider Near Eastern world. The irony is profound. The foreigners who conquered Egypt also equipped it with the military technology that would make the New Kingdom the greatest military power in the ancient world. The weapons that the Hyksos brought to Egypt would eventually be turned against them. A pattern so common in the history of conquest and liberation that it almost qualifies as a law of civilizational dynamics. The conquered learn from the conquerors. They adopt the superior technology, they improve upon it, and they use it to drive the conquerors from their land. The Egyptian mastery of chariot warfare would become so complete that, within a few generations of the Hyksos expulsion, the Egyptian chariot corps was the most formidable military force in the ancient world, a weapon of such devastating effectiveness that the great powers of the Near East measured their military strength in the number of chariots they could field. Egypt's mastery of this technology, a technology that had been brought to the Nile Valley by the very foreigners who had conquered it, is one of the great ironies of ancient military history. While the Hyksos ruled the north, the south of Egypt remained under the control of a native Egyptian dynasty, the 17th Dynasty, based at Thebes. The Theban kingdom was a rump state, a diminished remnant of the once unified Egyptian realm, squeezed between the Hyksos-controlled Delta in the north and the kingdom of Kerma in Nubia to the south. Its territory was limited to the stretch of the Nile Valley between roughly Abydos in the north and Elephantine in the south, a fraction of the territory that the Middle Kingdom pharaohs had governed. Its resources were correspondingly limited. Its military forces were modest. Its international prestige was negligible. Its economy was dependent on the agricultural output of Upper Egypt, a narrow strip of cultivable land that produced enough to sustain the population, but not enough to fund the kind of military build-up that would be needed to challenge the Hyksos. Its diplomatic situation was precarious, squeezed between two hostile powers, with no reliable allies and no strategic depth. The discovery of an intercepted letter from the Hyksos king Apepi to the king of Kerma requesting a coordinated attack on Thebes from south and north simultaneously reveals the terrifying vulnerability of the Theban position. If the Hyksos and the Nubians had succeeded in coordinating their military efforts, the Theban kingdom would have been crushed between them, annihilated in a pincer movement that would have ended the native Egyptian kingship forever. But the Theban kingdom preserved something that the Hyksos, for all their power, could not claim: the unbroken tradition of native Egyptian kingship. The Theban kings were Egyptians, ruling Egyptians. In the heartland of Egyptian culture, they were the legitimate heirs of the pharaonic tradition, and they nursed a grievance that grew over the generations, from resentment to resistance to open warfare. The war against the Hyksos began in earnest under Senusret II, who ruled Thebes in the mid-16th century BC. The transition from resentment to resistance to open warfare was gradual, a process that unfolded over decades rather than years, driven by the slow accumulation of military resources, the hardening of Theban resolve, and the growing conviction that coexistence with the Hyksos was impossible. We know very little about the specific circumstances that triggered the final rupture. A later literary text, The Quarrel of Apophis and Senusret, describes a petty diplomatic incident in which the Hyksos king Apepi complains that the hippopotamuses in the pool at Thebes are keeping him awake at night, even though Thebes is hundreds of kilometers from the Hyksos capital. The story is almost certainly fictional, a literary invention designed to portray the Hyksos king as an unreasonable bully and the Theban king as a justified defender of his people's dignity. But the real cause of the conflict was not hippopotamuses. It was the simple, irreducible fact that two kingdoms could not coexist indefinitely in the same river valley. The Nile flows in one direction. The trade routes run along it. The agricultural surplus that sustains civilization is generated by it. Whoever controls the river controls Egypt. And as long as the Hyksos controlled the delta and the Thebans controlled the south, neither side could claim true sovereignty over the land. Senusret II paid for the war with his life, and the evidence of his death is one of the most haunting artifacts in all of Egyptology. His mummy, discovered in the Deir el-Bahari cache in 1881, shows a man who died violently. The skull bears multiple wounds, at least 2 blows from an axe, a strike that crushed the bone above the left eye, and what appears to be a dagger wound to the neck. The wounds are consistent with the weapons used by the Hyksos military. The body shows no signs of having been properly prepared for burial. The arms are contorted, the face is frozen in a grimace of pain, the embalming was hasty and incomplete. The forensic analysis of the wounds is chilling in its precision. The first blow, delivered by a battle axe with a blade approximately 4 centimeters wide, struck the left side of the forehead, driving through the bone into the brain. A second blow, from a different weapon, possibly a mace, or a different type of axe, crushed the right side of the skull above the ear. A third wound on the right cheek may have been inflicted by a dagger or a spear thrust. The angles of the wounds suggest that the king was either standing when the first blow struck and fell to his left side, exposing his right temple to the second blow, or that he was already on the ground, perhaps knocked from his chariot when the killing blows were delivered. The most likely interpretation is that Senusret died on the battlefield, killed in combat against the Hyksos, his body recovered hastily and brought back to Thebes for a burial that was as rushed as it was inadequate. The sight of Senusret's mummy, the broken skull, the grimacing face, the awkwardly positioned limbs, is a visceral reminder of what the war against the Hyksos cost the Theban royal family. This was not an abstract political conflict. It was a fight to the death, a struggle in which the kings of Thebes put their own bodies on the front line and paid the ultimate price. Senusret's son Ahmose continued the war, launching aggressive campaigns northward that pushed the boundary of Theban control toward the approaches to the delta. A stela erected by Ahmose at Karnak describes his frustration with the divided state of Egypt in language that burns with patriotic rage. Why do I contemplate my power when there is a chieftain in Avaris and another in Kush, and I sit here associated with an Asiatic and a Nubian? The stela records Ahmose's military campaigns in vivid detail: the surprise attack on Hyksos-controlled territory, the plundering of enemy settlements, the terror of the Hyksos garrisons who found themselves under attack by forces they had underestimated. A second stela, known as the Carnarvon Tablet, provides additional details, including the interception of the letter from the Hyksos king Apepi to the king of Kerma, which Ahmose quotes triumphantly in his inscription. "Come, travel downstream. Do not be timid. He is here with me. I shall not let him go until you have arrived. Then we shall divide the towns of Egypt between us." The letter is proof that the Hyksos and the Nubians were planning a coordinated attack on Thebes, and its interception was one of the most important intelligence coups in ancient military history. Ahmose had caught his enemies in the act of plotting his destruction, and he used the captured letter as propaganda, quoting it in his inscription, to demonstrate both the danger the Theban kingdom faced and the skill with which its king had neutralized the threat. The interception of a Hyksos messenger carrying a letter requesting military aid from the king of Kerma, the attack on Hyksos-controlled territory in Middle Egypt, the capture of booty and prisoners. But Ahmose died before the job was finished, his reign lasting perhaps only 3 to 5 years, cut short by death under circumstances that remain unclear. He may have died in battle, like his father. He may have died of disease or wounds sustained in the fighting. The sources are silent on the matter. What they record is that the throne passed to his younger brother, a boy named Ahmose, who was perhaps 10 years old when he became pharaoh, a child inheriting a war, a boy whose childhood had been spent in a city that lived under the constant shadow of military threat, a city where the adults spoke of liberation and revenge and the recovery of the sacred land with a fervour that must have shaped the young prince's understanding of the world before he could fully comprehend it. Ahmose grew up in a household that had been defined by war. His father had died fighting the Hyksos. His brother had spent his short reign fighting the Hyksos. His mother would spend the regency maintaining the military readiness of the kingdom while her son grew to manhood. War was not something that happened to this family. War was what this family was for. And the young king, growing up in the palace at Thebes, while his mother governed the kingdom and his generals prepared the army, must have understood from his earliest years that the purpose of his life, the reason he had been born, the reason his ancestors had fought and died, was to finish the work that his father had begun. A boy, shouldering a mission that had already killed his father and his brother. The burden that fell on Ahmose's young shoulders was not merely the burden of kingship. It was the burden of liberation, the expectation carried by 3 generations of Theban kings, and fueled by a century of humiliation and the memory of fathers and brothers killed in the attempt that the foreigners would be driven from the sacred land, and the 2 lands would be made whole again. The weight of this expectation, the knowledge that his entire family had been defined by this mission, and that 2 of his closest relatives had died pursuing it, must have shaped the young Ahmose's character in ways that the sources cannot fully reveal. He was, from the moment of his birth, a child of war, raised in a household that talked of nothing but liberation, surrounded by soldiers who had fought under his father and his brother, absorbing from his earliest years the conviction that the purpose of his life, the meaning of his kingship, and the destiny of his people all converged on a single objective: the expulsion of the Hyksos from the sacred land of Egypt. The core problem that Ahmose faced was not merely military, it was existential. Egypt. The idea of Egypt, the civilizational concept that had sustained the Egyptian people through 15 centuries of continuous culture, was broken, not damaged, not diminished. Broken. The unity of the 2 lands, which had been the foundational principle of Egyptian political theology since the unification under the first pharaohs, was a fiction. There was no unified Egypt. There was a Hyksos kingdom in the north and a Theban kingdom in the south, and between them lay a contested middle ground where the authority of neither side was secure. The religious system that depended on a single pharaoh maintaining Ma'at across the entire land was inoperative. The administrative system that had governed a unified state was fragmented. The economic system that had distributed the Nile's agricultural surplus from the delta to the cataracts was severed. Egypt, in every meaningful sense, had ceased to exist. The military challenge was formidable in itself. The Hyksos were not a primitive people who could be overwhelmed by superior Egyptian civilization. They were a sophisticated military power with superior technology. The horse-drawn chariot, the composite bow, bronze weaponry of advanced design, and a strategic position of enormous strength. Avaris, their capital, was heavily fortified. The eastern delta, which they controlled, was the most agriculturally productive region of Egypt, the breadbasket of the kingdom, the source of the grain surplus that sustained the population and funded the state. The Hyksos also had diplomatic connections with other powers, the Kingdom of Kerma in Nubia, the city-states of the Levant, and possibly the Minoan civilization of Crete, whose artistic influence is visible in the frescoes that decorated the Hyksos palace at Avaris. A war against the Hyksos was not merely a domestic conflict. It was a war against a power that was embedded in the international system of the Eastern Mediterranean, a power with allies, trade partners, and strategic depth that extended far beyond the borders of Egypt. But the military challenge was not the most difficult part of Ahmose's task. The most difficult part was the question of what came after. Driving out the Hyksos would be an enormous military achievement, but it would not, by itself, restore Egypt. The administrative systems of the Middle Kingdom had been broken for over a century. The provincial officials who had governed the nomes under the 12th and 13th dynasties were gone. Their families dispersed, their records lost, their institutional knowledge dissolved. The religious institutions that had maintained the temples, performed the rituals, and sustained the theological framework of Egyptian civilization had been disrupted by a century of foreign rule. The economic connections between north and south, the trade routes, the grain shipments, the taxation networks that had integrated the Egyptian economy into a functioning whole had been severed. Reunification would require not just conquest but reconstruction, the rebuilding of an entire civilizational infrastructure from foundations that had been crumbling for 200 years. Ahmose could not begin this work immediately. He came to the throne as a child, and the early years of his reign were managed by his mother, Ahotep, who served as regent during his minority. Ahotep is one of the most remarkable women in Egyptian history. A queen mother who, according to an inscription on a stela at Karnak, looked after Egypt's soldiers and brought back her fugitives and collected her deserters. The inscription credits her with pacifying Upper Egypt and expelling rebels, language that suggests she played an active military role during the regency, maintaining the Theban kingdom's cohesion and military readiness while her son grew to manhood. Her burial, discovered by Auguste Mariette and Dr. Abu el-Naga in 1859, contained military decorations, including golden flies, which were awarded for valor in battle, that reinforced the impression of a woman who was not merely a ceremonial figure, but an active participant in the war effort. A queen who earned her military honors not through honorary gestures, but through actual service, possibly including personal command of troops during a crisis that threatened to destroy the kingdom during her son's minority. An inscription at Karnak credits her with rallying the Egyptian forces during what appears to have been an internal rebellion, an attempt by disaffected elements within Upper Egypt to take advantage of the young king's minority to overthrow the Theban dynasty. Ahotep suppressed this rebellion, maintained the kingdom's cohesion, and ensured that when Ahmose came of age, he inherited a unified and militarily prepared state rather than a fragmented and weakened one. Her contribution to the liberation of Egypt has been underappreciated by historians who focus on the military campaigns of the male pharaohs, but without Ahotep, there would have been no Ahmose. Without her regency, the Theban kingdom might well have collapsed during the dangerous years of the minority, and the liberation of Egypt might never have occurred. Ahotep held the kingdom together during the most dangerous years of Ahmose's minority, the years when a child king on a contested throne, surrounded by enemies to the north and south, might easily have been overthrown by rivals within his own court. The years of Ahmose's minority were not wasted. While Ahotep maintained political stability, the Theban military establishment continued to prepare for the campaigns that everyone knew were coming. The army was expanded. New weapons were manufactured. Officers were trained. Intelligence was gathered on the Hyksos defenses. The Theban kingdom, for all its limited resources, was being transformed into a military instrument, a state whose primary purpose was the prosecution of the War of Liberation. By the time Ahmose reached manhood, the Theban army was the product of 3 generations of preparation, a force that had been built, trained, and motivated specifically for the task of driving the Hyksos from the Delta and reunifying Egypt. When Ahmose came of age and assumed personal control of the government, probably in his late teens, he inherited a military machine that his father and brother had built and that his mother had maintained. The Theban army was not large by later Egyptian standards, but it was experienced, motivated, and hardened by decades of intermittent warfare with the Hyksos. Its officers were men who had fought under Senusret and Ahmose, veterans who had seen their kings fall in battle and who understood from personal experience the cost of the war they were fighting. Its soldiers were Upper Egyptians, men from the villages of the Nile Valley south of Abydos, men whose families had lived for generations under the shadow of foreign domination, and who fought not merely for their king, but for the idea of Egypt itself. The best source we have for Ahmose's military campaigns is not a royal inscription, but the autobiography of a soldier, a man named Ahmose, son of Ibana, who served in the king's army and who recorded his experiences in an inscription carved on the walls of his tomb at El-Kab, a town in Upper Egypt. This inscription is one of the most valuable documents in Egyptian military history, a first-person account of the wars of liberation, written not by a propagandist at the royal court, but by a man who was there, who fought in the battles, who risked his life and won honours for his bravery. The inscription describes Ahmose, son of Ibana's career, from his recruitment as a young soldier through his service in the campaigns against the Hyksos and the subsequent campaigns in Nubia and the Levant. It is direct, unadorned, and vivid, the testimony of a professional soldier whose primary concerns were his own valour, the rewards he received, and the approval of his king. Ahmose, son of Ibana, describes the siege of Avaris, the climactic battle of the War of Liberation, in language that conveys both the scale of the operation and the personal danger it involved. "I fought hand to hand," the soldier records. "I brought away a hand, the severed hand of an enemy, which Egyptian soldiers presented to their commanders as proof of kills in battle." The practice sounds gruesome to modern ears, but it was standard Egyptian military procedure, a system of accounting that ensured soldiers received credit for their valour and that provided commanders with a reliable count of enemy casualties. Ahmose, son of Ibana, records multiple instances of bringing hands to the king, evidence of repeated acts of close-quarters combat that placed him in direct physical danger. His rewards were substantial: grants of land, gifts of slaves, and the prestigious Gold of Valor, military decorations that marked him as a man of exceptional courage. The narrative of Ahmose, son of Ibana, is invaluable, not only for its content, but for its perspective. Royal inscriptions from this period, like all royal inscriptions in Egyptian history, present the pharaoh as the sole agent of victory, the divine warrior whose personal prowess determines the outcome of battle. The autobiography of a soldier offers a very different view, a view from the ground, from the front line, from the ranks of the men who actually did the fighting and the dying. Ahmose, son of Ibana, tells us that he followed the king on foot when he rode in his chariot, a detail that reveals the social hierarchy of the Egyptian military, in which the pharaoh rode in a chariot while the infantry marched on foot behind him. He tells us that he was brave in the presence of the king, language that suggests a military culture in which personal valour was displayed before the royal person and rewarded with tangible benefits. And he tells us that he received grants of land and captives after each campaign, the standard rewards of Egyptian military service, which created a class of veteran landowners whose prosperity was directly linked to the success of the pharaoh's wars. The siege of Avaris itself was a prolonged and difficult operation. The Hyksos capital was heavily fortified, surrounded by walls and waterways that made direct assault extremely costly. The archaeological evidence from Tel el-Dabba suggests that the city was not taken by a single dramatic assault but by a combination of siege warfare, naval operations on the waterways of the eastern delta, and repeated attacks that gradually wore down the defenders' resistance. The Egyptian fleet played a crucial role in the operations around Avaris, a detail that Ahmose, son of Ibana, emphasizes in his autobiography, noting that he served as a marine on the king's flagship and that naval combat was as important as land combat in the Delta campaigns. The waterways of the eastern delta, the interconnected channels and canals that made the region a labyrinth of islands and marshes, favored a defender who knew the terrain and an attacker who could control the water. Ahmose's navy, built and trained during the decades of preparation at Thebes, proved decisive in cutting off the Hyksos capital from its supply lines and from the reinforcements that might have been sent from the Levantine city-states that were allied with the Hyksos regime. The fall of Avaris was not a single dramatic event. It was the culmination of a sustained campaign that may have lasted several years, involving multiple assaults, naval blockades, and the systematic reduction of the defensive positions that protected the city. When the city finally fell, the event was momentous, the most significant military achievement in Egyptian history since the reunification of the two lands under Mentuhotep II more than 5 centuries earlier. But the fall of Avaris did not end the war. Ahmose pursued the retreating Hyksos across the Sinai into southern Palestine, besieging the fortress of Sharuhen, a stronghold in the Negev desert that served as a Hyksos refuge and staging area. The siege of Sharuhen lasted 3 years according to the inscription of Ahmose's son, Ibana, a timeline that, if accurate, represents one of the longest siege operations in ancient military history. 3 years of maintaining an army in the field, thousands of kilometers from home, in the arid conditions of the Negev desert. The logistical challenge alone was staggering. The soldiers had to be fed, watered, and supplied with weapons and equipment across a supply line that stretched from Thebes through the Delta, across the Sinai, and into southern Palestine. The determination that this effort required, the willingness to commit resources and manpower to a campaign that offered no immediate economic return, speaks to the depth of the Egyptian desire to ensure that the Hyksos threat was eliminated permanently. Sharuhin was not merely a military objective. It was a symbol, the last stronghold of the foreign enemy, the final obstacle between Egypt and the complete restoration of its sovereignty. And Ahmose was willing to wait 3 years to take it. According to the inscription of Ahmose's son of Ibana, an extraordinarily long operation that demonstrates both the determination of the Egyptian forces and the desperation of the Hyksos defenders. When Sharuhen finally fell, the Hyksos power was broken. The foreigners who had ruled Egypt for more than a century were driven from the land, and the Pharaoh stood once again as the undisputed master of the two lands. And it gets worse, or rather, it gets more complicated, because the expulsion of the Hyksos was only the beginning of Ahmose's challenges. With the foreign enemy defeated, Ahmose faced the even more daunting task of reconstruction, of putting back together a kingdom that had been divided, humiliated, and fundamentally transformed by a century of foreign rule. The Egypt that Ahmose reunified was not the Egypt that had existed before the Hyksos. The old administrative structures were gone. The old social hierarchies were disrupted. The old certainties, the unshakable confidence in the permanence and superiority of Egyptian civilization that had characterized the Middle Kingdom were shattered. The Egyptians had been conquered. They had been ruled by foreigners. They had been forced to accept, for more than a century, that the divine order which they believed governed the universe could be overturned by men with better weapons and better horses. The psychological damage of this experience should not be underestimated. The Egyptologist Jan Assmann, in his study of Egyptian cultural memory, has argued that the Hyksos period represents the single most traumatic event in the entire 3,000-year history of ancient Egypt, an experience that fundamentally altered the way Egyptians understood themselves, their gods, and their place in the world. Before the Hyksos, Egyptian identity had been grounded in the assumption of permanence, the belief that Egypt was, by divine decree, the center of creation and therefore immune to the kind of catastrophic change that afflicted lesser civilizations. After the Hyksos, that assumption was gone. Egypt was still the land of the gods. But the gods, it turned out, could be defeated. The center of creation could be conquered. The permanent could be broken. And the civilization that emerged from this shattering realization, the new kingdom, was a civilization that carried, in its bones, the knowledge that its greatest achievement could be its greatest vulnerability, and that the price of safety was eternal vigilance. A civilization that had believed itself to be the center of the world, the chosen land of the gods, the permanent and unshakable kingdom of Mart, had been forced to confront the possibility that it was none of these things, that it was merely another kingdom among kingdoms, vulnerable to the same forces of conquest and subjugation that afflicted every other people on earth. But here is what makes this truly terrifying and truly inspiring. Ahmose did not merely restore the old Egypt, he created a new one. And the scale of this creation, the sheer ambition of the new Egypt that Ahmose and his successors built, is one of the most remarkable phenomena in the history of human civilization. The Egypt that emerged from the Hyksos period was fundamentally different from the Egypt that had preceded it. More militaristic, more outward-looking, more aggressive, more imperial, and more aware of the wider world beyond the Nile Valley than any previous incarnation of Egyptian civilization. And here is the deepest paradox of all, the paradox that sits at the heart of this story, like a stone in a river, diverting the current of easy interpretation. The civilization that the Hyksos conquered was, in many respects, superior to the civilization that conquered it. The Middle Kingdom had been a civilizational achievement of the First Order, a golden age of literature, art, and administration. But it had been, in many respects, an inward-looking civilization, focused on the Nile Valley, concerned primarily with the management of its own internal affairs, and relatively uninterested in the broader world beyond its borders. The new kingdom would be something entirely different, an empire that projected power across the entire eastern Mediterranean, that maintained permanent armies, that conducted diplomatic relations with the great powers of the Near East, and that built monuments on a scale that dwarfed anything the Middle Kingdom had achieved. And the man who set this transformation in motion, the man who turned Egypt from a kingdom into an empire, was Ahmose I. The administrative reconstruction that Ahmose undertook was as significant as his military achievements, and in many ways more lasting. The reconstruction was not merely administrative, it was also physical. A century of division and conflict had taken a visible toll on the infrastructure of the Egyptian state. Temples had fallen into disrepair, irrigation systems had been neglected, roads and supply routes had been disrupted. The monumental architecture that was the visible expression of pharaonic power, the temples, the palaces, the fortifications that declared to the world that Egypt was a functioning civilization under the protection of its gods, needed to be restored, rebuilt, and in many cases constructed from scratch. Ahmose understood that the legitimacy of his newly reunified kingdom depended not just on military victory, but on the visible demonstration of civilizational competence, on the ability to build, to maintain, to create the physical infrastructure of a functioning state. A king who could defeat his enemies on the battlefield, but could not build a temple to thank the gods for his victory, was a king whose authority would always be incomplete. The old nomarchic system that had characterized the Old and Middle Kingdoms was not revived. The hereditary provincial governors, who had been such a prominent and problematic feature of earlier Egyptian governance, were replaced by a new class of appointed officials who owed their positions directly to the crown. The lessons of history had been learned. The Egyptians had seen, across 1,000 years of experience, what happened when local power was allowed to accumulate unchecked. The slow drift toward provincial autonomy, the gradual weakening of central authority, the eventual collapse into fragmentation that had destroyed the Old Kingdom and had contributed to the conditions that made the Hyksos conquest possible. Ahmose and his successors were determined not to repeat these mistakes. The transformation was not merely institutional, it was ideological. The Middle Kingdom had been a civilization of scribes, a culture that prized literary achievement administrative competence, and the quiet virtues of bureaucratic efficiency. The tale of Senusret, the masterwork of Middle Kingdom literature, is the story of a man who flees a political crisis and eventually returns home. A story about identity, about belonging, about the meaning of being Egyptian. The new kingdom would be a civilization of warriors, a culture that prized military achievement, personal valor, and the aggressive virtues of conquest and expansion. The literary texts that define the new kingdom, the Battle of Kadesh poem, the annals of Thutmose III, the war narratives of Rameses II and Rameses III, are stories about fighting, about killing, about the pharaoh as a superhuman warrior whose personal courage determines the fate of the kingdom. The shift from a literary culture to a military culture was one of the most profound consequences of the Hyksos experience, a transformation that reflected the new reality of a world in which cultural brilliance, without military strength, was no guarantee of survival. The new administrative system that emerged under Ahmose and was refined by his successors was more centralized, more professionalized, and more directly controlled by the crown than anything that had existed in the Middle Kingdom. The office of vizier, already powerful under the 12th Dynasty, became the linchpin of the entire administrative apparatus. 2 viziers were eventually appointed, one for Upper Egypt and one for Lower Egypt, creating a dual administrative structure that reflected the geographic and cultural division of the kingdom while maintaining centralized oversight. The military was reorganized on a professional basis, no longer the militia-based force of the Middle Kingdom, but a standing army of career soldiers, equipped with the chariot technology that the Hyksos had introduced and organized into divisions that could be deployed rapidly across the kingdom or projected abroad. The religious establishment was restructured around the cult of Amun at Karnak, the god who had sustained the Theban kings during the darkest years of the Hyksos period and who would become, under the new kingdom, the supreme deity of the Egyptian state, the king of the gods, whose temple complex at Karnak would grow, over the next 5 centuries, into the largest religious structure in the ancient world. Ahmose's building program, though modest by the standards of his successors, laid the groundwork for the monumental architecture that would define the new kingdom. The religious dimension of Ahmose's reconstruction deserves particular attention because it reveals the depth of the transformation that the Hyksos experience had wrought on Egyptian civilization. During the Hyksos period, the cult of Amun at Thebes had been sustained by the Theban kings as a symbol of native Egyptian identity, the god who stood against the foreign storm god Baal-Seth that the Hyksos worshipped. Amun had been, in a sense, the god of the resistance, the deity who had sustained the Theban kings during their darkest hours and who had, in the Egyptian understanding, granted them the eventual victory over the foreigners. The new kingdom's elevation of Amun to the supreme position in the Egyptian pantheon, king of the gods, the universal deity whose power encompassed all other gods, was a direct consequence of this association. Amun was not merely a god who happened to be worshipped at Thebes. He was the god who had saved Egypt, and the temples that the new kingdom pharaohs built for him, the vast complex at Karnak, the elegant temple at Luxor, the mortuary temples on the west bank of the Nile, were not merely places of worship. They were thank offerings, monuments of gratitude to the god, who had sustained the Egyptian people through the worst crisis of their civilization, and who had granted them the victory that made the new kingdom possible. Ahmose began construction at Karnak, initiating the process of expansion that would transform the modest Middle Kingdom temple into the vast complex that visitors see today. He built at Abydos, the sacred city of Osiris, where he erected a cenotaph, a symbolic tomb, and a small pyramid that was the last royal pyramid ever built in Egypt. The pyramid is significant not for its size, which was modest, but for its symbolism. It represented a deliberate connection to the tradition of the Middle Kingdom and the Old Kingdom, a declaration that the New Kingdom was not merely a new dynasty, but a continuation of the pharaonic tradition that stretched back to the very beginnings of Egyptian civilization. The cultural impact of the Hyksos period and the wars of liberation on Egyptian civilization was profound and lasting. Before the Hyksos, Egypt had been a civilization that looked primarily inward, focused on the Nile Valley, concerned with the maintenance of Mat within its own borders, and relatively indifferent to the affairs of the wider world. After the Hyksos, Egypt became a civilization that looked outward, acutely aware of the threats that existed beyond its borders, determined to prevent any future invasion through the projection of military power, and increasingly engaged with the complex web of diplomatic, commercial, and military relationships that connected the great civilizations of the Near East. The Hyksos had taught Egypt a lesson that it would never forget: that isolation was not safety, that the desert barriers and the cataracts that had protected Egypt for millennia were not impregnable, that a civilization that failed to project power beyond its borders was a civilization that would eventually be conquered by someone who did. This lesson, the lesson of vulnerability, was the driving force behind the new kingdom's transformation from a kingdom into an empire. Ahmose's campaigns in southern Palestine, the siege of Sharuhen, the pursuit of the fleeing Hyksos into the Levant, were not merely punitive expeditions. They were the first steps in a strategic program of forward defense that would, under Ahmose's successors, evolve into full-scale imperial expansion. The Nubian campaigns that Ahmose launched after the fall of Sharuhen were as significant in their own way as the war against the Hyksos. With the northern threat eliminated, Ahmose turned his attention south, to the kingdom of Kerma, which had taken advantage of Egypt's weakness during the Hyksos period to expand northward into territory that had once been under Egyptian control. Ahmose's Nubian campaigns pushed the Egyptian frontier back to the Second Cataract, roughly the same boundary that Senusret III had established 4 centuries earlier, and reasserted Egyptian control over the gold mines and trade routes that were essential to the kingdom's economic health. The fortress chain that Senusret had built was reoccupied and rebuilt. The Nubian populations that had moved into formerly Egyptian territory during the Second Intermediate Period were pushed back or subjugated. The southern frontier was secured, and the revenue from the Nubian gold mines began flowing northward to the Egyptian treasury, funding the building programs and military expeditions that would define the new kingdom. Ahmose's successors would expand these achievements to a scale that Ahmose himself could barely have imagined. Thutmose I would campaign as far as the Euphrates River in modern Syria. Thutmose III, the Napoleon of Egypt, would fight 17 campaigns in the Levant and establish Egyptian control over a vast empire stretching from the Fourth Cataract of the Nile in Nubia to the borders of Mesopotamia. Hatshepsut would send trading expeditions to the mysterious land of Punt. Amenemhat III would preside over an era of unprecedented wealth and diplomatic sophistication, and Rameses II would build monuments of a scale and grandeur that have defined the popular image of ancient Egypt ever since. All of this, the entire extraordinary trajectory of the new kingdom, from the 18th century BC to the 12th century BC, began with Ahmose. He opened the door, his successors walked through it, and the world that lay on the other side of that door was a world that no previous Egyptian pharaoh had imagined. A world of empire, of international diplomacy, of permanent armies and frontier fortresses, and the constant, exhausting, intoxicating projection of power across distances that the Middle Kingdom administrators would have considered impossible. The new kingdom would last approximately 500 years, from Ahmose's liberation around 1550 BC to the death of the last Ramesside pharaoh around 1070 BC, and during those 5 centuries, it would produce the civilization that the modern world thinks of when it hears the word Egypt: the golden mask of Tutankhamun, the colossal statues of Ramesses at Abu Simbel, the painted tombs of the Valley of the Kings, the great hypostyle hall of Karnak, with its 134 columns rising to heights that make modern visitors feel like insects walking through a stone forest. All of this was the new kingdom, and all of it began with Ahmose. The story of Ahmose and the Hyksos, the story of a conquered civilization that fought its way back to independence and then transformed itself into an empire, is a story that has echoes across the entire span of human history. The pattern of foreign conquest, native resistance, eventual liberation, and subsequent imperial expansion is one of the most common and most consequential patterns in the history of civilizations. And the parallels between Ahmose's Egypt and other civilizations that have undergone similar transformations illuminate, by comparison and contrast, the nature of what happened in the Nile Valley in the 16th century BC. Let us begin with the civilization that offers the most dramatic parallel to the Egyptian experience, the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula. For nearly 8 centuries, from the Muslim conquest of Visigothic Spain in 711 AD to the fall of Granada in 1492, the Iberian Peninsula was divided between Muslim and Christian kingdoms in a configuration that bears a remarkable structural resemblance to the division of Egypt between the Hyksos north and the Theban south. Like the Theban kings, the Christian kingdoms of the north, Asturias, Leon, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, preserved the tradition of the pre-conquest political order and nursed a multi-generational grievance against the foreign rulers of the south. Like the Theban kings, they built their military strength gradually, over centuries, through a combination of intermittent warfare, strategic alliances, and the slow accumulation of territory and resources. And like the Theban kings, they eventually drove the foreign rulers from the peninsula and unified the land under a single native dynasty. The comparison extends to the timeline. The Theban War of Liberation took roughly 3 generations, from Seqenenre-Dao's first campaigns to Ahmose's final victory at Sharuan. The Reconquista took approximately 30 generations, a vastly longer timeframe that reflects the different scale of the conflict and the different political structures involved, but the underlying dynamic was the same in both cases. A multi-generational commitment to liberation, sustained across decades or centuries by a combination of religious conviction, cultural identity, and the simple refusal to accept foreign rule as permanent. The Theban kings passed the mission of liberation from father to son like a sacred inheritance, each generation taking up the sword where the previous one had fallen, each king measuring himself against the predecessors who had died in the attempt. The Christian kings of the Reconquista did the same, each generation advancing for the frontier a little further south, each king adding to the territory that had been recovered, each victory building the momentum that would eventually carry the Christian kingdoms to the shores of the Mediterranean. The parallels extend beyond the basic narrative to the consequences. Just as the expulsion of the Hyksos transformed Egypt from an inward-looking kingdom into an outward-looking empire, the completion of the Reconquista in 1492 transformed Spain from a fractured peninsula of competing kingdoms into the most aggressive imperial power of the early modern world. The same year that Granada fell, the same year that the last Muslim ruler surrendered the keys of the Alhambra to Ferdinand and Isabella, Columbus sailed west across the Atlantic, beginning the process of European colonial expansion that would reshape the world. The connection is not coincidental. The Reconquista had created a military culture, a religious fervor, and a hunger for conquest that could not be contained within the borders of the peninsula once the peninsula was unified. The math is striking when you compare the timelines. The Theban Liberation War lasted approximately 3 generations. The Reconquista lasted approximately 30 generations. The Chinese liberation from the Mongols lasted approximately 1 generation. Zhu Yuanzhang accomplished in roughly 20 years what took the Thebans 3 generations and the Iberians 30. The speed of liberation depends on many factors: the relative military strength of the liberators and the occupiers, the geographic and strategic circumstances of the conflict, the internal cohesion of the liberation movement, and the willingness of the occupied people to sacrifice for the cause. But in every case, the pattern is the same. The liberation transforms the liberators. The people who fight their way free from foreign rule are not the same people who were conquered. They are harder, more determined, more militaristic, and more aware of the world beyond their borders, and the energy that the liberation unleashes. The combination of relief, pride, anger, and ambition that follows the expulsion of the foreign enemy drives them to achievements that the pre-conquest civilization could never have imagined. The same men who had been fighting the Muslims for generations, The same military culture, the same religious certainty, the same combination of aggression and faith, simply redirected its energy outward across the ocean toward the lands that Columbus had stumbled upon. Hernan Cortés, who conquered the Aztec Empire with a handful of soldiers and a great deal of audacity, was a product of the Reconquista culture. So was Francisco Pizarro, who destroyed the Inca Empire. So were the thousands of lesser conquistadors who spread across the Americas in the decades after 1492, carrying with them the military skills, the religious fervor, and the imperial ambition that the Reconquista had forged. The Liberation War had created a civilization that could not stop fighting, because fighting was what it knew, fighting was what it was, and the end of one enemy merely created the need for a new one. The conquistadors who conquered Mexico and Peru were the direct heirs of the warriors who had driven the Muslims from Spain, men who carried the same cross, wielded the same sword, and were animated by the same combination of religious zeal and material ambition. The Egyptian parallel is striking. The warriors who followed Thutmose III to the Euphrates and Thutmose I to the Fourth Cataract were the direct heirs of the warriors who had followed Ahmose to the walls of Avaris, men whose military culture had been forged in the furnace of the Liberation War, and who carried the same combination of patriotic fervor and professional ambition into the wider world. The new kingdom's imperial expansion was, in a very real sense, the Liberation War continued. The same energy, the same military machine, the same determination to ensure that Egypt would never again be vulnerable to foreign conquest, directed outward rather than inward. The Hyksos had awakened something in Egypt that the Middle Kingdom had never known. A drive for empire, a hunger for military glory, a determination to project power beyond the borders of the Nile Valley. And once awakened, that drive could not be satisfied by mere liberation. It demanded expansion. It demanded the assurance, purchased in blood and sustained by permanent military commitment, that the sacred land would never again be vulnerable to the kind of conquest that had nearly destroyed it. The new kingdom's empire was not an empire of ambition in the conventional sense. It was an empire of fear, an empire built not by a civilization that wanted to conquer the world, but by a civilization that was terrified of being conquered by it. Let us now consider a second parallel, one that illuminates the question of how a conquered civilization processes the psychological trauma of foreign domination. The Mongol conquest of China in the 13th century AD, the destruction of the Song dynasty and the establishment of the Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan was, for the Chinese, an experience comparable to the Hyksos conquest of Egypt, a civilization that considered itself the center of the world, the Middle Kingdom, the celestial empire, the pinnacle of human achievement, was conquered and ruled by a nomadic people whom the Chinese had traditionally regarded as barbarians. The psychological shock of this conquest reverberated through Chinese culture for centuries, shaping the way the Chinese understood their own history, their relationship to the non-Chinese world, and the nature of the civilizational vulnerability that the conquest had exposed. The Ming dynasty, which expelled the Mongols in 1368, bears a remarkable resemblance to Ahmose's new kingdom. Like Ahmose, the Ming founder Zhu Yuanzhang was a man of humble origins who rose to power through military skill and political cunning. Like Ahmose, he inherited a liberation movement that had been building for decades, a movement fueled by Chinese resentment of Mongol rule and by the desire to restore the native dynasty to the throne. Like Ahmose, he conducted a series of military campaigns that drove the foreigners from the homeland and reunified the kingdom under native rule. And like Ahmose, he presided over a period of post-liberation reconstruction that transformed the character of Chinese civilization. The founding of the Ming dynasty involved military campaigns that bear a remarkable resemblance to Ahmose's wars of liberation. The gradual expansion of rebel-held territory from a base in southern China, the slow encirclement of the Mongol capital at Beijing, and the final decisive assault that drove the foreign dynasty from the throne. Zhu Yuanzhang, like Ahmose, came from a background that would have seemed unpromising for a future ruler. He was a former Buddhist monk and beggar who had joined a rebel movement and risen through its ranks. by sheer ability and determination. The parallels are not exact. Zhujiang's path to power involved civil war among competing rebel factions as well as war against the Mongols, while Ahmose's struggle was more straightforwardly a war of national liberation. But the underlying pattern is the same: a native leader operating from a regional power base who mobilizes popular resentment against foreign rule to build a military force capable of expelling the conquerors and reunifying the kingdom. The Ming dynasty's response to the trauma of Mongol conquest was, in some respects, similar to the New Kingdom's response to the Hyksos. Both civilizations became more militaristic, more centralized, and more concerned with border defense in the aftermath of foreign domination. The Ming built, or rebuilt, the Great Wall of China on a scale that dwarfed anything that had existed before, creating a defensive barrier that was, in its strategic function, remarkably similar to the New Kingdom's system of frontier fortresses in Nubia and the Levant. Both civilizations also became more inward-looking in some ways and more outward-looking in others. The Ming initially launched ambitious naval expeditions under Admiral Zheng He that projected Chinese power across the Indian Ocean, but later withdrew from maritime activity and focused on internal consolidation. The New Kingdom, by contrast, maintained its outward orientation for centuries, projecting power across the Levant and deep into Nubia in a sustained program of imperial expansion that lasted until the Bronze Age collapse of the 12th century BC. But there is a crucial difference between the Ming response and the Egyptian response that illuminates an important dimension of the liberation dynamic. The Ming dynasty, after its initial period of outward expansion under the Yongle Emperor, eventually turned inward, shutting down the naval expeditions, restricting foreign trade, and focusing on internal consolidation and defense. The Great Wall, rebuilt and extended under the Ming to a scale that dwarfed its earlier incarnations, became a symbol of this inward turn, a declaration that China would defend its borders but would not seek to expand them, that the Middle Kingdom would be content to be the Middle Kingdom and would not aspire to be a world empire. The New Kingdom, by contrast, maintained its outward orientation for centuries, continuously projecting military power across the Levant and deep into Nubia, maintaining permanent garrisons in foreign lands, conducting diplomatic relations with every major power in the Near East. The difference may reflect the different geographic and strategic circumstances of the two civilizations. Egypt, located at the crossroads of Africa and Asia, could not afford the luxury of isolation in the way that China, protected by oceans, deserts, and mountain ranges, could. But it may also reflect a deeper difference in the way the two civilizations processed the trauma of conquest. China by withdrawing behind its walls, Egypt by smashing through the walls of others. But the most significant parallel between the Ming dynasty and the New Kingdom lies in the cultural realm, in the way both civilizations used the memory of foreign domination as a source of political legitimacy and cultural identity. The Ming emperors, like the New Kingdom pharaohs, defined themselves in opposition to the foreigners they had expelled. They presented their rule as a restoration of the native tradition, a return to the proper order of things after the disruption of foreign domination. They cultivated a fierce cultural nationalism that rejected foreign influence and celebrated the superiority of the native civilization. And they used the memory of the conquest as a warning, a reminder that the price of weakness was subjugation, and that the only guarantee against future conquest was permanent military vigilance. The kind of vigilance that required not just walls and armies, but a fundamental reorientation of national priorities, a permanent commitment of resources and attention to the defense of borders that previous generations had taken for granted. There is one more example that deserves consideration, one that brings us full circle to the theme of civilizational identity and its relationship to military power. The Roman experience with the Gallic sack of Rome in approximately 390 BC, an event that traumatized Roman civilization in much the same way that the Hyksos conquest traumatized Egypt, offers a final illuminating parallel. The Gauls, a Celtic people from northern Italy, defeated the Roman army at the Battle of the Allia and occupied the city of Rome itself. an event that the Romans remembered as the worst catastrophe in their history. The city was sacked, the temples were burned, and the Romans were forced to pay a humiliating ransom in gold to persuade the Gauls to withdraw. The phrase Vae Victis, woe to the conquered, attributed to the Gallic chieftain Brennus, became one of the most quoted sayings in Roman history, a permanent reminder of the shame of defeat and the price of weakness. The Roman response to the Gallic sack was remarkably similar to the Egyptian response to the Hyksos. The Romans rebuilt their city with stronger walls, the Servian Wall, a massive fortification that would protect Rome from external attack for centuries. They reformed their military, abandoning the archaic phalanx formation that had failed against the Gauls, and adopting the more flexible manipular system that would make the Roman legions the most formidable military force in the ancient world. They launched a program of military expansion that would, over the next 3 centuries, bring the entire Italian peninsula under Roman control and eventually establish Rome as the dominant power of the Mediterranean. And they cultivated a fierce military culture, a culture of discipline, endurance, and relentless aggression that was fueled, in no small part, by the memory of the Gallic sack and by the determination that Rome would never again be so vulnerable. The phrase Metus Gallicus, the Gallic fear, entered the Roman vocabulary as a term for the existential dread of foreign invasion that drove Roman military preparedness for generations after the sack itself had receded into the distant past. The parallels with the Egyptian Metus Hyksos, if we may coin the phrase, are unmistakable. Both civilizations were traumatized by a foreign conquest that shattered their assumptions of invulnerability. Both responded with a comprehensive military and institutional transformation that made them far more powerful than they had been before the conquest. Both cultivated a cultural memory of the conquest that served as a permanent source of military motivation and national cohesion, and both eventually built empires that far exceeded the scale of the kingdoms that had been conquered, empires whose power and ambition were, in a very real sense, the products of the trauma that had given them birth. The numbers are striking. Egypt was under Hyksos rule for approximately 108 years. China was under Mongol rule for approximately 89 years. Spain was under Muslim rule for approximately 781 years. In each case, the period of foreign domination left a permanent mark on the civilization that experienced it, transforming its military culture, its political institutions, its sense of identity, and its relationship to the wider world. And in each case, the civilization that emerged from the experience was fundamentally different from the one that had been conquered. Harder, more militaristic, more aggressive, more aware of its own vulnerability, and more determined to prevent the experience from ever happening again. Let us consider one more example that brings a different dimension to this discussion: the Greek experience with Persian invasion in the 5th century BC. Unlike the other cases we have examined, the Greeks were not conquered by the Persians. They successfully repelled 2 Persian invasions, at Marathon in 490 BC and at Salamis and Plataea in 480 and 479 BC. But the threat of Persian conquest, the near-death experience of an entire civilization facing annihilation by a vastly superior military power, had effects on Greek civilization that were remarkably similar to the effects of actual conquest on Egypt, China, and Spain. The post-Persian War period in Greece saw the same combination of military expansion, cultural flowering, and aggressive nationalism that characterized the post-Hyksos New Kingdom. The Greek response to the Persian threat also produced a transformation in military technology and tactics that parallels the Egyptian adoption of Hyksos military innovations. The Athenian navy, which had been built largely in response to the Persian threat, under the leadership of the statesman Themistocles, became the instrument of Athenian imperial power in the decades after the Persian Wars. Just as the Egyptians adopted and improved upon the chariot technology that the Hyksos had brought to the Nile Valley, the Athenians adopted and improved upon the naval technology that had been developed in response to the Persian threat, creating a fleet of triremes, fast, agile warships powered by 3 tiers of oarsmen that gave Athens mastery of the eastern Mediterranean. Athens, which had played a leading role in the defeat of the Persians, transformed itself from a modest city-state into the head of a maritime empire that dominated the eastern Mediterranean. The Athenian Empire, like the New Kingdom Egyptian Empire, was justified in part by the need to maintain a permanent defense against the Persian threat. The revenues that flowed to Athens from its subject allies funded the construction of the Parthenon and the other monuments of the Athenian Acropolis. Monuments that were, like the temples of Karnak and Luxor, expressions of a civilization that had survived a mortal threat and that celebrated its survival with building projects of unprecedented scale and ambition. The parallels extend to the literary realm as well. Aeschylus's play The Persians, performed in Athens in 472 BC, is a dramatic celebration of the Greek victory over the Persians that bears a striking resemblance to the Egyptian literary and inscriptional tradition celebrating the expulsion of the Hyksos. Both are works that transform a military victory into a cultural narrative of civilizational survival and national identity. Both are also works that serve a political purpose, reinforcing the legitimacy of the post-liberation regime by associating it with divine favor and civilizational destiny. The Athenian Empire, like the New Kingdom, justified its power by presenting itself as the protector of civilization against barbarism, the shield that stood between the civilized world and the forces of chaos. The Delian League, which Athens organized to maintain a permanent naval defense against Persia, was the Greek equivalent of the New Kingdom's frontier fortress system, a permanent military alliance that was initially defensive in character, but that gradually evolved into an instrument of Athenian imperial control. The league dues that the allied cities paid to Athens, originally intended to fund the common naval defense, were eventually used to finance the construction of the Parthenon in a diversion of collective resources to national glory that has troubled historians and ethicists ever since of civilizational survival and divine favor. But here is the problem that links all of these examples, and that brings us back to the specific story of Ahmose and the New Kingdom. And it gets stranger, because the consequences of liberation, in every case we have examined, extend far beyond the military sphere. The civilizations that fight their way free from foreign domination do not merely recover their former strength. They surpass it. They do not merely restore the status quo ante. They create something new. Something that the pre-conquest civilization could not have imagined, and that the conquerors never intended. The New Kingdom was not the Middle Kingdom restored. It was the Middle Kingdom transcended, a civilization that took everything the Middle Kingdom had been and added to it a military ferocity, an imperial ambition, and a monumental grandeur that the scribes and administrators of the 12th Dynasty could never have dreamed of. The same pattern appears in every case. The Reconquista produced not merely a unified Spain, but the Spanish Empire, the most extensive colonial enterprise in history. The Ming overthrow of the Mongols produced not merely a restored Chinese kingdom, but one of the most sophisticated and prosperous civilizations the world has ever known. A civilization that, under the Yongle Emperor, launched the greatest naval expeditions of the pre-modern world. The Greek defeat of the Persians produced not merely the survival of Greek civilization, but the Athenian Golden Age, the era that produced Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles, the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides, the sculptural achievements of Phidias, the architectural brilliance of the Parthenon, the philosophical, artistic, and literary flowering that laid the foundations of Western civilization, the energy that liberation unleashes, the military vigor, the cultural nationalism, the aggressive self-confidence that comes from having survived a mortal threat, is not infinite. It is a finite resource, like oil in a reservoir, like the burning charge in a rocket, like the emotional intensity that follows any great collective experience. The generation that fights the war of liberation burns with a passion that is fueled by direct experience, by the memory of conquest, by the grief for fallen fathers and brothers, by the visceral hatred of the foreign enemy that has occupied the sacred land. The second generation inherits some of that passion, diluted by the passage of time, by the transition from lived experience to cultural memory, but still potent enough to drive continued military expansion and national consolidation. By the third and fourth generation, the passion has cooled further. The memory of conquest has become myth rather than memory. The hatred of the foreigner has become abstract rather than personal. The urgency that drove the founders has been replaced by the routine competence of professional administrators and career soldiers. The liberation energy that had driven the new kingdom's expansion was, by the reign of Ramesses II, roughly 3 centuries after Ahmose, still present but transformed. Ramesses fought the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BC, in one of the largest chariot battles in ancient history. A battle that ended in a tactical draw, but that Ramesses portrayed in the most extensive propaganda campaign in Egyptian history, as a personal triumph of superhuman courage and divine favour. The battle narrative that Ramesses commissioned, carved on the walls of temples throughout Egypt and preserved in multiple literary versions, presents the pharaoh as a lone hero, abandoned by his army, fighting thousands of Hittite charioteers single-handedly until the god Amun grants him miraculous strength. The narrative is absurd as history, but revealing as psychology. It shows a pharaoh who still needs to present himself as a warrior, who still draws his legitimacy from personal military valor, but who can no longer generate genuine military victories to support the claim. The liberation energy has not disappeared. It has become performative, a cultural memory of warrior kingship that is maintained through propaganda rather than through actual combat. It is a resource that is consumed in the process of being deployed. The new kingdom lasted approximately 5 centuries, from Ahmose's liberation in the mid-16th century BC to the collapse of the 20th Dynasty in the mid-11th century BC. During that period, the liberation energy that Ahmose had unleashed was gradually consumed, spent on military campaigns, on building projects, on the maintenance of an empire that stretched across northeast Africa and the eastern Mediterranean. The curve of the new kingdom's power traces a perfect arc, rising from the liberation under Ahmose through the imperial zenith under Thutmose III and Amenemhat III, plateauing under the Ramessides, and declining through the latter part of the 20th Dynasty into the third intermediate period. Each phase of the arc can be mapped to the diminishing intensity of the liberation energy, from the white-hot fury of Ahmose and Ahmose, through the disciplined ambition of Thutmose III, to the bureaucratic competence of the later New Kingdom administrators who maintained the empire without the passionate conviction that had created it. By the time of Ramesses III, the last great warrior pharaoh, who defeated the Sea Peoples in a series of desperate battles around 1177 BC, the energy was running low. The empire was overextended, the bureaucracy was strained, the population was weary, the military was exhausted, the treasury was depleted, and the liberation that had seemed, under Ahmose, like the beginning of an eternal golden age had proved to be, in the end, merely another chapter in the endless cycle of rise and fall that defines the history of civilizations. And now we come to the question that has been building beneath the surface of this entire story. The question that emerges, inevitably, when you sit with the history of Ahmose and the Hyksos long enough for it to stop being history and start being something personal, something that touches the fundamental anxiety of any civilization, any culture, any community that has ever looked at the strength of the walls it has built and wondered whether they would be enough. The question is this: what does it mean for a civilization to be conquered? Not what does it mean in the history books, not what does it mean in the archaeological record, but what does it mean for the people who live through it? For the Egyptian farmer who watched foreign soldiers march through his village, for the Theban priest who performed rituals to gods who had failed to protect the land, for the mother who taught her children the old stories of Egyptian greatness, knowing that the greatness was gone. What does conquest mean for the ordinary people who must continue to live, to work, to raise their children, to bury their dead, in a world that has been turned upside down? A world in which the certainties that sustained their parents and their grandparents have been shattered beyond repair, not politically, not militarily, not in terms of territory and tribute and the transfer of power from one set of rulers to another. Those are the mechanics of conquest, the surface phenomena that the inscriptions record and that the historians catalogue. The deeper question, The question that the quarrel of Apophis and Seqenenre was really about, and that the autobiography of Ahmose, son of Ibana, was really about, and that the entire New Kingdom building program at Karnak and Luxor and Abydos was really about, is what conquest does to the soul of a civilization, what it does to the stories a people tell about themselves, what it does to the mother who sings her child to sleep with a lullaby about the greatness of her people, knowing that the greatness is a memory rather than a reality, what it does to the priest who performs the rituals of a faith that promise divine protection, and then watches foreign soldiers walk through the temple gates, what it does to the scribe who copies the ancient texts, the instructions, the prophecies, the tales of Egyptian triumph, in a world where the triumphs are past and the present is ruled by foreigners, what it does to the assumptions they hold about their place in the world, what it does to the faith, the deep, usually unexamined faith, that their way of life is permanent, that their gods are powerful, that the order they have built will endure. The Hyksos shattered that faith for 15 centuries. From the unification of the two lands under the first pharaohs to the fall of the Middle Kingdom, the Egyptians had lived inside a story of civilizational permanence. The Nile would flood, the crops would grow, the pharaoh would maintain Mat, the gods would protect Egypt from its enemies. The two lands would endure forever, because the two lands were the center of creation, the place where the gods had first brought order out of chaos, the land that was, by divine decree, inviolable and eternal. The Hyksos proved that this story was wrong, not wrong in its details. The Nile still flooded, the crops still grew, but wrong in its fundamental assumption of permanence. Egypt could be conquered, the gods could fail. The order that was supposed to be eternal could be broken by men with chariots and composite bows. Let that sink in. A civilization that had existed for a millennium and a half, that had built the pyramids, that had created one of the world's first writing systems, that had produced literature and art and architecture of extraordinary sophistication, was told, by the brute fact of foreign conquest, that none of these achievements guaranteed its survival. That civilization, like a human body, like a human life, was mortal, that the walls could be breached, that the borders could be crossed, that the gods could be silenced, that the throne could be taken, that the cosmic order that was supposed to guarantee Egypt's permanence was, in the end, just a story that could be interrupted, overwritten, or simply ignored by people with better weapons and the will to use them. This was the most devastating revelation of all. Not the political fact of foreign rule, but the theological implication that the entire framework of meaning within which the Egyptians had understood their existence might be a fiction. If the gods could not protect Egypt from conquest, what could they protect? If Mart could be overturned by foreigners, was Mart real? If the pharaoh was not the guarantor of cosmic order, what was he? These questions that struck at the very foundations of Egyptian identity, were the deepest wounds that the Hyksos inflicted, and the healing of these wounds required not just military victory, but a complete reimagining of what Egypt was, what its gods could do, and what its pharaohs were for. The Hyksos did not burn the temples, or if they did, the evidence is uncertain and contested. They did not destroy the pyramids. They did not erase the inscriptions. They did not suppress the Egyptian language, or forbid the practice of Egyptian religion. In many respects, the Hyksos were tolerant rulers, more interested in controlling the trade routes and extracting the agricultural surplus than in imposing their cultural identity on the conquered population. But the tolerance almost makes it worse. The Hyksos did not need to destroy Egypt. They merely needed to rule it, to sit on the throne, to collect the taxes, to control the resources. The destruction was not physical, it was psychological. It was the slow, corrosive realization, building over decades, that the civilization you believed to be eternal was in fact merely contingent, dependent on circumstances that could change, vulnerable to forces that could not be controlled, subject to the same laws of rise and fall that governed every other kingdom in the world. The New Kingdom's response to this shattering revelation was not despair, it was transformation. The Egyptians did not withdraw into nostalgic mourning for the lost certainties of the Middle Kingdom. They reinvented themselves. They took the military technology that the Hyksos had brought, the chariot, the composite bow, the bronze weapons, and they mastered it, turning the instruments of their humiliation into the instruments of their power. They took the administrative experience of the Middle Kingdom, the bureaucratic efficiency, the centralized governance, the literary culture, and they combined it with a military professionalism that the Middle Kingdom had never possessed. They created a synthesis, a civilization that was simultaneously a cultural powerhouse and a military machine that could produce exquisite art and deploy devastating armies, that could negotiate treaties in 7 languages and besiege fortified cities for 3 years. They took the lesson that the Hyksos had taught, that a civilization must project power beyond its borders or be conquered by those who do. And they applied it with a thoroughness and a determination that would make Egypt, for the next 5 centuries, the dominant military power in the ancient world. They took the trauma of conquest, the psychic wound of having been ruled by foreigners, and they converted it into fuel, the anger that the Theban kings had nursed for generations, the humiliation that the Egyptian people had endured for a century, the grief for the kings who had died fighting to restore the sacred land. All of this was channeled into the greatest burst of civilizational energy that Egypt had ever produced. This is not science fiction. This is the documented historical reality of a civilization that was broken and that chose not merely to heal but to transform, to become something greater, something more powerful, something more ambitious than it had ever been before. The new kingdom did not merely restore Egypt, it exceeded Egypt, surpassing every previous achievement of Egyptian civilization in military power, architectural grandeur, artistic sophistication, and territorial reach. The Karnak temple complex, which began as a modest shrine and grew under the new kingdom into the largest religious structure in the ancient world, a complex covering more than 100 hectares, containing massive hypostyle halls whose columns soar to heights that still stagger visitors today, is the physical expression of this transformation. It is not merely a temple, it is not merely a place of worship or a royal monument or an architectural achievement. It is a statement, a declaration, carved in stone on a scale that defies comprehension, that the civilization which built it has overcome the worst that fate can deliver, and has emerged not merely intact but greater. Let that sink in. The greatest architectural achievement of ancient Egypt, the monument that more than any other defines what Egypt means in the imagination of the world, was built by a civilization that had been conquered, humiliated, and forced to reinvent itself. It was not built by a civilization at the height of its confidence and power. It was built by a civilization that had known the worst, that had been broken and had put itself back together, and that carried, in every stone and every column and every painted surface and every carved inscription and every gold-leafed shrine, the memory of what it had survived and the determination never to be so vulnerable again. There is a word for what happened to Egypt in the 16th century BC, a word that the psychologists use but that applies, with uncanny precision, to the experience of civilizations as well as individuals. The word is resilience, or perhaps more precisely, what the psychologists call post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon in which individuals who have experienced severe trauma not only recover but emerge from the experience with capacities and insights that they did not possess before. The research on post-traumatic growth shows that individuals who survive catastrophic experiences, war, natural disaster, life-threatening illness, sometimes develop a deepened sense of purpose, a greater appreciation for life, a clearer understanding of their own values, and a willingness to take risks and embrace challenges that they would have avoided before the trauma. The mechanism is not fully understood, but the pattern is well documented. The experience of being broken can, under certain circumstances, produce growth that would not have occurred without the breaking. The parallel with the Egyptian experience is almost uncanny. The Middle Kingdom Egyptians were a civilization of extraordinary achievement, but they were also, in some fundamental sense, complacent. They believed their walls were strong enough. They believed their gods were powerful enough. They believed their civilization was permanent enough to withstand any threat. The Hyksos proved them wrong, and the shattering of that complacency was the precondition for the growth that followed. Without the breaking, there would have been no motivation to change. Without the change, there would have been no new kingdom. And without the new kingdom, the history of the ancient world and the civilization that the modern world inherits would have been fundamentally different. The archaeologist Barry Kemp, in his study of ancient Egyptian society, has described the New Kingdom as a civilization that was intoxicated by its own power, a civilization that built on a scale and with an ambition that reflected not merely confidence but a kind of desperate need to prove to itself and to the world that it was not the fragile, conquerable kingdom that the Hyksos had exposed. The enormous temples, the colossal statues, the vast tombs, these are not the works of a civilization that feels secure in its power. They are the works of a civilization that is trying to convince itself that its power is real, that the nightmare of the Hyksos is over, that the walls are strong enough now, that the gods have returned and will not leave again. The New Kingdom's monumental ambition was, in this reading, a form of compensation, a therapeutic response to the trauma of conquest, expressed in stone and gold and the overwhelming scale of structures that said, louder than any inscription, "We are here, we are powerful, and we will never be conquered again." Not merely survival, not merely the ability to endure a catastrophe and continue to exist in diminished form, but the ability to be transformed by catastrophe into something stronger, more capable, and more aware than what existed before. Consider the evidence. The Old Kingdom, the civilization of the pyramids, lasted roughly 5 centuries and produced the most impressive monumental architecture in the ancient world. But it never built an empire. It never projected sustained military power beyond the borders of the Nile Valley. It never engaged with the wider world in any systematic way. The Middle Kingdom, the civilization of the great literature, lasted roughly 3 centuries and produced the most sophisticated literary and administrative culture of the ancient world. But it too remained essentially inward-looking, focused on the Nile Valley, concerned with internal governance, and relatively indifferent to the affairs of distant lands. The New Kingdom, the civilization forged by the Hyksos experience, lasted roughly 5 centuries and produced everything: the largest temples, the most powerful armies, the most extensive empire, the most elaborate tombs, the most sophisticated diplomacy, the most ambitious building programs. And it did all of this because it had been broken, because the experience of being conquered had shattered the complacency that had limited its predecessors and had released an energy that could not have been generated by any other means. The New Kingdom was not merely the continuation of the Middle Kingdom after an interruption. It was the Middle Kingdom's successor, a civilization that honored the traditions of its predecessor while fundamentally exceeding them, that drew strength from the memory of weakness, and that built the greatest monuments the ancient world had ever seen on foundations of grief, anger, and the hard-won knowledge that nothing, not even the kingdom of the gods, is permanent. We have traced the arc of Ahmose's story from the broken skull of his father Senusret II to the walls of Avaris, from the wars of liberation to the reconstruction that followed, from the boy king who inherited a besieged kingdom to the man who launched the most powerful civilization the ancient world had ever seen. We have seen how a century of foreign domination transformed Egypt, not merely politically or militarily, but psychologically, fundamentally, at the level of civilizational identity. And we have seen, in the comparative evidence from Spain, from China, from Greece, that the pattern of conquest, liberation, and imperial transformation is not unique to Egypt but universal, a recurring pattern in the history of civilizations that reveals something essential about the way human societies respond to existential threat. So, what does this mean for us? What does the story of Ahmose and the Hyksos tell us about the nature of civilizational resilience, about the capacity of human societies to survive catastrophe and to emerge from it transformed? It tells us, first, that the darkest moments of a civilization's history are often the seedbeds of its greatest achievements. The Hyksos conquest was, by any measure, a catastrophe for Egypt, a century-long nightmare of foreign domination, political fragmentation, and cultural humiliation that seemed, while it was happening, to herald the end of Egyptian civilization, but it was also the crucible in which the new kingdom was forged. The experience that gave Egypt the military technology, the outward orientation, and the fierce determination that would make it, for the next 5 centuries, the dominant power in the ancient world. Without the Hyksos, there would have been no new kingdom. Without the conquest, there would have been no empire. Without the humiliation, there would have been no Karnak, no Luxor, no Valley of the Kings, no Rameses the Great. The greatest achievements of Egyptian civilization were produced not by a civilization at the height of its confidence, but by a civilization that had been broken and remade. A civilization that built its monuments on a foundation of grief and anger, and the knowledge that the walls can always be breached. The pattern is visible not just in the grand sweep of civilizational history, but in the specific details of the new kingdom's rise. The chariot corps that became the backbone of the Egyptian military, the weapons system that gave Thutmose III his victories at Megiddo and Kadesh, was a direct legacy of the Hyksos. The diplomatic system that connected the new kingdom to the other great powers of the Near East, the system of royal correspondence preserved in the Amarna letters, in which the pharaoh exchanged messages with the kings of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, and the Hittites, was a product of the outward orientation that the Hyksos period had forced upon a previously insular civilization. Even the new kingdom's religious architecture, the massive temple complexes that defined the era, reflected the new reality of a civilization that needed to project power and inspire awe on a scale that the modest temples of the Middle Kingdom had never required. Every aspect of the new kingdom, its military, its diplomacy, its architecture, its religion, its sense of identity, was shaped by the experience of Hyksos and by the determination to ensure that the experience would never be repeated. It tells us, second, that the technology and ideas of conquerors often become the most powerful tools of the conquered. The chariot that the Hyksos brought to Egypt became the decisive weapon of the new kingdom military. The composite bow that the Hyksos introduced became standard equipment for Egyptian soldiers. The awareness of the wider world that the Hyksos forced upon a previously insular Egypt became the strategic vision that drove the new kingdom's imperial expansion. The very instruments of Egypt's humiliation were transformed, in Egyptian hands, into the instruments of Egyptian power. This pattern, the adoption and adaptation of the conqueror's technology by the conquered, is one of the most important dynamics in the history of civilizations, and it appears in every case we have examined. The Iberians adopted the military techniques and administrative methods of their Muslim conquerors. The Chinese adopted and improved upon the military technology of the Mongols. The Greeks absorbed and transformed the cultural influences of the Persian world they had defeated. In every case, the conquered proved more creative in the use of the conqueror's innovations than the conquerors themselves, because the conquered had something the conquerors did not: the motivation that comes from the knowledge that your survival depends on your ability to adapt. It tells us, third, that the memory of conquest is both a source of strength and a source of danger. The new kingdom's ferocious military culture, its permanent armies, its aggressive frontier defense, its willingness to project power across vast distances, was driven, in large part, by the memory of the Hyksos. The determination to prevent any future foreign conquest was the engine that powered the new kingdom's imperial expansion. But that same determination also trapped Egypt in a cycle of military commitment that was ultimately unsustainable. The empire that Ahmose's successors built required constant military maintenance, permanent garrisons in Nubia and the Levant, regular campaigns to suppress rebellions, massive expenditures on weapons, chariots, and military personnel. The cost of preventing conquest was, in the end, the cost of empire, and the cost of empire, sustained over centuries, eventually exceeded what the Egyptian economy could bear. The Amarna letters, the diplomatic correspondence found at the city of Akhetaten, built by the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, reveal a new kingdom that was already, by the 14th century BC, struggling to maintain its imperial commitments. The letters from vassal rulers in the Levant are filled with pleas for military assistance. desperate requests for Egyptian troops to defend against threats from rival city-states, from nomadic raiders, and from the expanding power of the Hittite Empire to the north. The Egyptian response, as recorded in the correspondence, was often delayed, inadequate, or non-existent, evidence that the imperial machine was beginning to run down, that the resources required to maintain Egyptian control over a vast and unruly empire were straining the capacity of the Egyptian state. The new kingdom did not fall to a second Hyksos invasion. It fell to the internal exhaustion of a civilization that had been living on a war footing for 5 centuries. 5 centuries of permanent military mobilization, of continuous frontier defense, of the relentless consumption of resources and manpower that empire demands. The liberation that had saved Egypt from the Hyksos had also, in the long run, condemned it to an unsustainable level of military commitment that had spent 5 centuries fighting to prevent the recurrence of a trauma that had happened 1,000 years earlier. The cost was real. The new kingdom's military culture produced extraordinary achievements, but it also consumed extraordinary resources. The standing army that the new kingdom maintained required a permanent commitment of manpower and wealth. The chariots that were the backbone of the military required horses, animals that had to be bred, trained, fed, and maintained at considerable expense. The bronze weapons and armor required access to copper and tin, metals that Egypt did not produce in sufficient quantities, and that had to be imported from abroad, creating strategic dependencies that made the Egyptian economy vulnerable to disruptions in international trade. The frontier fortresses and garrison towns that protected the empire required permanent garrisons of soldiers who could have been more productively employed as farmers, craftsmen, or laborers. The diplomatic gifts that the new kingdom sent to allied and rival powers, gold, jewels, fine textiles, and luxury goods, represented a continuous drain on the royal treasury that had to be replenished through taxation, tribute, and the exploitation of the Nubian gold mines. The empire was expensive, and the expense, sustained over centuries, gradually exceeded the revenue, creating the fiscal crisis that would, in the end, contribute to the new kingdom's decline. And it tells us, finally, something about the nature of Ahmose himself, the boy king who inherited a war and who became the founder of the greatest era of Egyptian civilization. Ahmose did not merely win battles. He did not merely conquer territory. He did not merely rebuild an administration. He changed what Egypt was. He changed what Egypt meant, not just to the Egyptians, but to the world. Before Ahmose, Egypt was a civilization, impressive, ancient, culturally sophisticated, but fundamentally a local power, a Nile Valley kingdom whose influence rarely extended beyond the borders of the Delta and the Cataracts. After Ahmose, Egypt was a superpower, the dominant military and political force in the eastern Mediterranean, a player on the world stage whose interests and ambitions touched every major civilization from Mesopotamia to the Aegean. The transformation was so complete, so fundamental, so far-reaching in its consequences that it is sometimes difficult to remember that the Egypt of Thutmose III and Ramesses II grew directly from the Egypt of Ahmose, that the greatest empire in the ancient world was born in a besieged city in the south of a divided kingdom, in the heart of a family that had been fighting the same war for 3 generations. He transformed a traumatized, divided, diminished kingdom into a confident, unified, aggressive empire, not by restoring the past but by reimagining the future. The Egypt he created was not a restoration. It was a revolution, a fundamental break with everything that had come before, disguised in the language and imagery of continuity and tradition. Ahmose presented himself as a restorer, a king who was putting Egypt back the way it had been. But in truth, he was creating something that had never existed before, something bigger, more powerful, and more dangerous than anything the Middle Kingdom had imagined. Something that would dominate the ancient world for half a millennium. The Egypt that Ahmose created would produce the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, the underground chambers carved into the rock of the Theban hills where the new kingdom pharaohs were buried with treasures of gold, jewels, and exquisitely crafted funerary goods. It would produce the temples of Abu Simbel, where Ramesses II carved his colossal image into the cliff face as a warning to the Nubians, and a declaration of Egypt's eternal power. It would produce the diplomatic correspondence of the Amarna letters, revealing a world of international relations, royal marriages, and political intrigue that connected Egypt to every major civilization in the Near East. It would produce the religious revolution of Akhenaten, who attempted to replace the traditional gods with a single deity, the Aten, the sun disk, in a theological experiment that may have been the first expression of monotheistic thought in human history. All of this, every temple, every tomb, every letter, every revolution, traces its origin to the moment when a boy king looked north toward the walls of a foreign capital and decided, with the cold certainty of a boy who has buried too many of his family, that the foreigners would go. Something that began with a boy king in a besieged city, looking north toward the walls of a foreign capital, carrying in his heart the memory of his father's broken skull and the weight of a century of shame. It is late. The Nile flows past ancient Thebes in the warm darkness, as it has flowed since before there were pharaohs to claim its waters and priests to pray for its floods. The temples of Karnak are silent, their massive columns casting shadows in the starlight, their walls covered with inscriptions that no one reads at this hour. Somewhere in the Valley of the Kings, the body of Ahmose lies in whatever remains of the wrappings that his embalmers placed around him 3,500 years ago. His mummy discovered, like so many others, in the great cache at Deir el-Bahari, where the priests of a later age gathered the royal dead to protect them from the tomb robbers who had been plundering the valley for centuries. His mummy was examined by modern forensic specialists, who found, beneath the wrappings, the body of a man who had lived approximately 35 to 40 years. A relatively short life even by the standards of the ancient world, cut short by the cumulative toll of decades of military campaigning and the physical demands of governing a kingdom in an era before modern medicine. The body shows evidence of healed injuries, the marks of a life spent in warfare, in the saddle of a chariot, on the battlefields where the future of Egypt was decided by men who fought with bronze weapons at close quarters. The boy king is a mummy now. The arms that swung a Khopesh sword at the walls of Avaris are crossed over a chest that no longer breathes. The eyes that watched the Hyksos flee across the Sinai are empty sockets in a face that the centuries have reduced to leather and bone. But the kingdom he built endures, not as a political entity, not as a functioning state, but as an idea. The idea that a civilization can be broken and remade, that a people can be conquered and can fight their way back, that the worst moment of a nation's history can become the foundation of its greatest achievements. Ahmose would not recognize the Egypt that exists today, a modern nation of over 100 million people, speaking Arabic rather than the language of the pharaohs, worshipping under the crescent and the cross rather than the falcon of Horus and the sun disk of Ra. But the land is the same, the river is the same, and the pattern, the eternal Egyptian pattern of collapse and recovery, of destruction and rebuilding, of death and resurrection, is the same pattern that has defined this civilization since the first pharaoh placed the double crown upon his head and declared himself the Lord of the two lands. So here is the answer to the question that has been building through this long night. What happens when a civilization is conquered? What happens when the walls are breached, when the foreigners sit on the throne, when everything that seemed permanent proves to be fragile? The answer, according to the evidence of Ahmose and the Hyksos and the New Kingdom and the 3,000 years of Egyptian history that followed, is this: it depends. It depends on whether the conquered people preserve the memory of who they were, the stories, the traditions, the sense of identity that defines them as a civilization rather than merely a population. It depends on whether they produce leaders who are willing to fight, not just with weapons, but with ideas, with institutions, with the patient, multi-generational determination to reclaim what was lost. It depends on whether they are willing to learn from their conquerors, to adopt the technologies and the strategies that made conquest possible and to turn them against the conquerors themselves. And it depends on whether they are willing to change, to accept that the civilization that was conquered was, in some ways, inadequate, and that the civilization that emerges from the experience must be different, stronger, more aware of the world and of its own vulnerability. Ahmose met all of these conditions. He preserved the memory, he fought the fight, he learned from the enemy, and he changed everything, transforming Egypt from a kingdom into an empire, from a victim into a power, from a civilization that had been broken into a civilization that would build the most magnificent monuments the ancient world had ever seen. We do not know what Ahmose thought in the quiet moments, the moments between battles, between councils of war, between the ceremonies and the campaigns and the administrative decisions that filled his days. We do not know whether he felt the weight of the mission that had been placed on him, the expectation of 3 generations, the grief of a family that had lost its patriarch and its heir to the war, the responsibility of representing, in his own person, the hopes and the fury of an entire people. We do not know whether he ever doubted, whether, in the dark hours before the assault on Avaris, he lay awake and wondered whether the walls would hold, whether his army was strong enough, whether the gods who had failed his predecessors would sustain him. We know only what the inscriptions tell us, and the inscriptions, as always, tell us only what the scribes chose to record and the king chose to approve. The mummy in the museum case tells us nothing about the living man. The crossed arms, the linen wrappings, the amulets placed by priestly hands over the silent chest, these are the artifacts of death, not of life. But the kingdom he built, the temples he began, the army he forged, the dynasty he founded, the empire he launched, these tell us everything. They tell us that the boy king who inherited a war became the man who won it, that the child who watched his father's broken body, carried back from the battlefield, became the pharaoh who drove the invaders from the sacred land and remade the world. Remember the face of Seqenenre, the broken skull, the grimacing mouth, the wounds that tell the story of a king who died fighting for a cause he could not achieve in his own lifetime. Remember Ahmose, who carried the fight forward and died before the job was finished. Remember Ahotep, the queen mother who held the kingdom together with military decorations on her chest, and the loyalty of an army that knew she had earned the right to command it. And remember Ahmose, the boy who became a man in the shadow of war, who inherited a mission that had already consumed his family, and who fulfilled it with a completeness that transformed the world. The Nile flows on, the desert is quiet. The stars above Thebes are the same stars that Ahmose saw when he stood on the roof of his palace and looked north, across the dark water, toward the walls of Avaris, walls that he would one day break, one day breach, one day stand upon as the first true pharaoh of a reunited Egypt. He was a boy when the mission fell on him. He was a man when he fulfilled it. And between the boy and the man lies the story of one of the most extraordinary transformations in the history of human civilization. The transformation of defeat into victory, of humiliation into glory, of a broken kingdom into the greatest empire the ancient world had ever known. An empire that would endure for 5 centuries, and that would define, for all time, what the word Egypt means. The silence that follows this story is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of completeness. The silence that comes when everything that can be said has been said, and what remains is not words but understanding. The understanding that civilizations are not permanent, that they can be broken, that the breaking, if the people who endure it are brave enough and stubborn enough and angry enough, can become the beginning of something greater than what was lost, that the boy king who inherited of war and fought his way to a throne is not merely a historical figure but an embodiment of the capacity that every human community carries within itself. The capacity to refuse despair, to turn grief into fuel, to build from the ruins of the old something that the old could never have imagined. That is the story of Ahmose I, the pharaoh who drove out the invaders, the king who rebuilt the kingdom, the founder of the new kingdom, and the proof, carved in stone and preserved in sand and carried by the Nile across the millennia, that the darkest hour of a civilization's history can also be the hour of its rebirth. Sleep now, but remember the boy king. Remember that the greatest civilization the ancient world ever knew was born not in a palace, but in a war, not in confidence, but in grief, not in strength, but in the determination to never be weak again. Remember that the walls of Avaris fell, and that from their ruins rose something the world had never seen before,